So, yeah, what do you want to start talking about this article first?
One thing that I noticed personally was that she decided to start off the article by like comparing and like bringing up stuff that Neanderthals did that were very similar to like Homo sapiens. I thought that was interesting to like start off her argument by saying how we're not so different, even though like the common belief is that Neanderthals are not as intelligent as early modern humans were. So I thought that was interesting.
hmm So, yeah, so a
Okay.
lot of similarities. And how much of that was new to you? How much of that was surprising to you?
Uh, for me personally, most of it was new. I always thought that like Neanderthals were just kind of like just an inferior species of human.
hmm
Didn't think they had tools or anything like that.
Yeah, one thing that I thought was interesting at the beginning, because I'd forgotten this, was part of the reason why Neanderthals were considered to be a more, like a more inferior type of primate was because the first individuals that were found had some like degeneracy markers of like old age as opposed like of
Mm-hmm.
individual old age rather than representing what these people would have looked like in their prime. So I thought that was interesting. So so we start off with this preconceived notion kind of handed down that wasn't really based on what the species was going to end up looking like. This actually isn't super uncommon. It happens a lot that um, there are cases that happens a lot where we something is discovered and we have like these first impressions that can be kind of hard to shed, especially if we're looking at fossil primates, just because there were not a lot of fossil primate species. It's not as controversial if you find like a new kind of wolf or a new kind of new kind of sauropod or something.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, Carly, what do you want to start off talking about this?
I found it really interesting when they started talking about the brain, mostly because I got lost immediately when they were
Mm,
talking about the the endocast of the brain,
mm-hmm.
specifically the I think it was the frontal lobe. In when they were talking about like the cognitive capabilities of Neanderthals, and kind of going off of what like Kevin said of like my pre-knowledge of Neanderthals was like none. I didn't really know anything other than kind of that cartoonish portrayal of them being. I like think of like the stick against their head, like boink. That is my immediate thought. So it was kind of interesting to get into that, and when they were talking about like the different sides of the brain and how that affects it, um, and the ultimate conclusion of like that Neanderthals were not as they were less cognitively adept is the word they chose to use. Um, and I just thought that that was like a really interesting way for them to get to it was through this like different analysis of like the skull in combination with like the genome.
Yeah.
Um, and some a method I don't understand, and I think it was because it was partially disputed, was the measuring of the eye sockets.
Mm-hmm.
Said something about that and how that may not have been um, a good way of measuring that, being that it like was a comparison of the brain, how much that was filling up in the brain rather than with the optic area or something of that sorts.
So yeah, so here's the idea with it. The So the cranial endocasts are what makes the shape of your skull, the round part of your skull called the cranium. What makes the shape of your skull is actually a lot of it in humans is caused by the growth of the brain. Human babies are born with really with unfused skull bones because the brain is still growing at a pretty fast rate there, and it isn't until and basically when the brain stops its growth, that's when the sutures start to become more solid and finally ossify. Um, so for a long time, we figured there's a good connection. I mean, in mammals generally, but in primates in particular, and in people, there's been a relationship between what the shape of the inside of the brain, the inside of the skull is, and what the shape of the brain was during life. So people are doing endocast studies for a long time because we from looking at human brains, we we know that certain parts of it are going to be enlarged relative to other parts, and if we, it allows us to kind of use the comparative method to see how our brains are different from our relatives. Um, so, and about brain parts being different sizes, in mammals, brain regions are pretty, are pretty evolutionarily determined. Meaning, brain regions like where the brain stem is, or where the hypothalamus is, or where the, where the cortex is. Those things are not very plastic. They don't vary from individual to individual. They don't vary by species. Um, they vary by connectivity a little bit, and particularly that when they vary in size, we use that as an indication to mean that if you have a part of your brain that's really large, you figure it must be there because there are a lot of cells working on that, and a lot of nerve cells working on the same task are going to give you a big part of a brain. Now, the comparison of looking at the visual cortex with the size of the eye. Um, there have been studies in other kinds of animals about looking at the relative size of the optic, well, basically the size of the eye socket, as well as the width of the optic nerve that goes into the brain. You'd figure like a narrower optic nerve reflects fewer retinal cells, fewer nerve cells going in, and a wider optic nerve would mean more. Similarly, if you have a wider gauge optic nerve going in, and you have a large visual center, which is in the back of the brain called the occipital lobe, a larger occipital lobe, then that would mean that there's not only a lot of information going in, but a lot of brain volume that's dedicated to trying to process it. So the reason why those kinds of studies are interesting is it lets us, we're trying to look for as many possible markers of different kinds of brain function as possible. Um, there are like other, and so I think that the visual cortex, particularly because it's on like the the outside of the posterior part of the brain, it makes it a little bit easier to compare. So I sort of like that. Just because I understand I understand the morphology stuff better, just because that's more like in my wheelhouse. But then trying to make the connections between genes with behaviors, that's in some ways that's really seductive too, because it's all these animals have genes. We have pretty complete genomes for lots of these fossil species. So then we're able to get to some kind of try, at least try to test some kind of hypotheses for how things work. So what, which ones did you find more interesting or more compelling in terms of what the answers were like? The studies that were about like brain shape or, eye socket shape, or the ones that related to how genes work?
So kind of going off of that, they did mention in the article how I think it was the amygdala, Broca's area, and like the overall surface area of like the gray matter was different in Neanderthals than like early modern humans, and how all those areas specifically kind of have a relation to language, and how since those areas were smaller, that's probably why Neanderthals kind of had a harder time, we think, communicating with each other, or why Homo sapiens were more able to like adapt and kind of expand because we were better at communicating with each other. That's what I got from it.
No, I would agree with that. Yeah, so Broca's area is part of the brain that does what we call motor speech, actually the production of words, not the understanding of words or writing or anything like that, but it's particularly about being able to speak. People who are in side impact car accidents often have trouble with aphasia afterwards because of, when you're if you knock your head, knock the left side of your head, like on the windshield or something, then that's more likely to damage, the parts that control how you talk. Yeah, the amygdala does like fear, aggression, and I can't remember the other parts you mentioned. Oh, look at the overall cortex, surface area. Species that have bigger surface areas for their gray matter in the cortex, they tend to be the ones who have more neural connections and can have like higher cognitive abilities. So it's the reason why the brain is folded like it is it's actually this like surface, the gray matter on the surface. If you can like crump it up, like you crumple up a piece of paper, you can fit in more surface in a smaller area. And so that's part of that's the reason why we see, you look at like a fish brain or a shark brain, the cerebrums there are like totally smooth. But when you get into birds and mammals, they start getting more and more folded to be able to fit in, kind of like, tuck in more and more of the surface area for new thinking. What else was new or confusing or interesting to you in this article?
Another thing that I thought was like one thing that was new for me was that I learned that right-handedness has to do also with language, I guess. I never knew that there was like a relation between the two.
It has to do with it in the sense that there are these brain asymmetries. Um, but yeah, but I agree. I hadn't really thought about it. I didn't know that there was, this sort of like, how do they know that the Neanderthals were right-handed? But
Yeah.
yeah, that you can get from like archaeological evidence, from looking at how, like, cut marks on bones and stuff, and figuring out which way
Mhm.
a knife would have had to have been held. But yeah, and then yeah, but the fact that Broca's area is only on one side. Yeah, no, I agree. The sort of brain asymmetries that result in yeah, different kinds of abilities.
Mhm.
I think one of the parts of this that was really interesting is when it started talking about like the ethical concerns of potentially um, like the creation of the Neanderthal cells, and how we had basically an entire class talking about the ethical concerns of bringing like a Neanderthal into the modern sense. Um, and I thought it was really interesting how some genes. So one of the like sentences in it is Neanderthals had some genes no longer in circulation. And I thought that was a really interesting sentence because it took a lot to like unpack in my head of some genes would not even, I guess, make sense or don't really play a role anymore, or that we can't see in their genome that would impact differently now. Because this is in specific relation to like the Neanderthal skin color, um, based on like the genetics that they share with humans, and how we would predict that now is not an actual accurate representation. Um, and so that also just made me think of like the flaws in what is perceived out of a genome when there is a lot left unknown in that sense when it's so long ago and there is only so much information you can collect.
Yeah. No, I like that. Yeah, genes no longer in circulation. It's like, um, we can compare human genes with, well, the genomes of humans or the genomes of other animals, because we're comparing particular genes that we share in common. But novel genes come into existence. Other genes kind of get whittled out either by selection or just mutation. Um, well, selection, mutation first, then selection. But yeah, the idea that there are these places where, just places where Neanderthals, and some of these Neanderthal genes we don't have like complements for in modern humans. So trying to make it, trying to do those sort of cell studies where you make these transgenic nerve cells that you try to see what they do in culture, what kinds of connections they make. Yeah, the idea that the cells aren't going to be, able to respond in the same way. Although usually cells are, like I said, cells are dumb, and if you give them a gene for something, they'll be able to process it. But so if I thought that was an interesting way to think about it, but I was trying to think about how it actually would, what actually wouldn't work in that process. Yeah, is there anything else that you want to talk about before we split today?
Yeah, one thing I wanted to bring up was that kind of like towards the end, they kind of brought up the extinction of Neanderthals, and I found it interesting how like the last kind of like quote that they brought in was that they didn't necessarily like die out, or they weren't like picked out to die out. It's just that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals started like living together, so the genes kind of maybe just faded together, and then we kind of just turned into one species. I think that was an
Well,
interesting way.
well, I think the it was more like the population getting swamped out than when like we merged, So I don't think that's the
Okay.
right way to think about it. But the yeah, there are so many. I don't know. I think that there are a lot of possible ways that these, the extinction models for how Neanderthals went out. Um, but there's something. But there are a lot of hypotheses that are just like untestable. The gene ones we actually we can make some cases for. But could it just be that Neanderthals had a slower reproductive rate? It could just be something as simple as, unlike humans who can get pregnant any time of year, as opposed to lots of kinds of animals that come into season once a year or a couple times a year. It could, and then that also ignores, and that's just a biological explanation. There could be social things too for why it is that Neanderthals would be less likely to be breeding super fast. So no, it's a big and open and still I think an interesting question about like why they went out, because it says something about, it makes us try to estimate something about their biology, but also thinking about how our human nature would have also could have also been the cause of this. So,
I
well,
noticed that they Neanderthals stuck to larger game too. So
yeah,
it
that was
kind of
interesting too. It's sort of like, so maybe it was more of a, if they're, I mean, although they were able to eat plants periodically, maybe it was
mhm.
more of a feast or famine kind of situation. They weren't going for rabbits or raccoons or anything. They're mostly after just big stuff that can sustain them.
Yeah,
Hmm.
that's what I
All
was
right.
thinking.
Well, that's what I got for today. So, well, say goodbye to anybody who watches this.
Hmm. Bye.